Welcome to Faith Baptist Church, where faith is our first name. Faith means we believe. We believe the Bible is the Word of God, and we believe that Jesus is the answer, and we sincerely believe that there's a place here for you. Faith, it's who we are, and it's who any one of us can be in Jesus.
So our church started in September of 1974, and from that point forward, the Lord blessed in a marvelous way. Now, to be honest, because I had no experience with church planting, I never knew anyone that had started a church from scratch. And so I did not realize that we were really having a very good start. To me, it was, we were chipping this out of stone, and that it was moving so slowly. And I certainly had no sense of setting the woods on fire, and in that sense we really didn't. But I do know, from having been a part of many church plants since that time, that we had a wonderful start, and that the Lord really blessed, and there were just so many open doors. There were all the trials and the tribulations, the difficulties, but it was always moving forward, and we are so thankful, to look back and just to see the way that God had His hand on the ministry of Faith Baptist Church. Now, we weren't sure what to call the church. What should be its name, and now the church that had sponsored us was Faith Baptist Church. But I had ties to other churches with other names, and we looked at several things. But when we just took a giant step back and looked at, I was thinking about, well, maybe we could use a landmark, a neighborhood or a area of the community. I thought about Chancellor Baptist Church or Spotsylvania Baptist Church, something like that. But and at that point, those churches exist. There are churches with those names, but not at that time. But we weren't there. At that point we were in Falmouth, just across the river from Fredericksburg, and we were going to be in a couple of other locations before we ended up on Route 3. And so, we thought, well, faith, not only is it our sponsoring church, but it is who we are, that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. In other words, it is not here. This is a matter of faith. And we chose that name, and that name has perfectly fitted the ministries of Faith Baptist Church, down through the decades, that it has been a work of faith in every sense. So we named the church Faith Baptist, and we met in our townhouse, for a couple of months until it was too crowded. We used our dining room table for Sunday school. We used our living room for the church service. And it was, quickly, filling up, and we had, we were running probably 25 there, and we're talking about a tiny little townhouse. So this is not. It was obvious that we were going to need to find a better home, and so we looked all over. I tried the public schools, looking for a place to meet. I met with a principal who was a believer, but he said no, with church and state limitations, that there was no way that they could rent to us. And yet, just a few months later, they did rent to the Catholic Church for a couple of years while they built new facilities. So it's a matter, in small towns, it's a matter of who you know and what connections can be made, which we had none at that point. So we looked, and we finally found a little building. There was a house, good size house that had been converted into an office building, but had not yet been rented out. Matter of fact, it was owned by AAA, and they planned to move their offices there, but they still had a location downtown. But that was going to become the new post office. That property was going to be demolished, and the post office was going there. So they rented us, that facility. It's 2300 Jefferson Davis Highway, right on Route 3. It's out in the Twin Lakes area there. And matter of fact, Shirley and I visited that on one of our church anniversaries recently when we were just reminiscent and nostalgic. And we went by and looked over that building. As a matter of fact, found some people there. They let us in, let us make some pictures and look around. But that was a wonderful little place for us to start. It was a 2-story house, and then it also had a finished basement. It was finished as a room and maybe an office downstairs. But the way it was laid out, it was just perfect. We had our church office upstairs, and then we had our nursery upstairs as well. And probably now I wouldn't put a nursery upstairs, but that was, in those days we were full of energy and nobody had trouble with stairs. But there were 4 bedrooms up there, each on the 4 corners of the house, and then downstairs there was a large, probably had been a living room or at some point, but there was enough for us to get in about 40 chairs. And we used that for an auditorium, then had a back porch, and we used that for our big Sunday school room. We had some nice chairs that had been donated by a place that was getting rid of some furniture, and so we had some nice leather chairs that we put out in that back porch area, and that's where we had our adult Sunday school. And then we had a little kitchen and a fellowship area. It was just really well suited, and we knew that once we outgrew the living room upstairs, with the 40, that we could move downstairs. It would be less ideal as far as not the perfect room, but it would actually hold more people. So we felt like we could be there for, maybe a year or 2 years as we looked for property, and we were already looking for property. But we moved in there in about the middle of November of '74. And we hadn't been there long. We grew there. Matter of fact, there's some apartment complexes there in the Twin Lakes area. We started visiting there. We got some people, from there that would come. Now in the house, basically the members, the people that stayed with us, were my 2 brothers who would drive down from, they both now were living in Manassas, and they would drive down with their families for the service, and so we had their families. We had, of course, my family, and then the Galls, Mickey and Helene Gall, that we won to the Lord there in that neighborhood. They came and plugged into the ministry, and they had a couple of young children. And then Mark and Chris Hollister, who we had the opportunity to win to the Lord, and they came and with their young children. And Elizabeth Brooks at the time later became Elizabeth Akers after she married, and she came with hers. And then there was a young lady, Mary Marion, and then her niece, Patty, those came, and so those were the people that were really solid with us, in the very beginning there at the townhouse. And then we moved over to Jefferson Davis, and then we began to get some families out of the apartments and so forth, and we had some good growth. And it's during that time that we chose to organize. And just before we set our date for January the 19th of 1975 to organize the church, and just before that service, we were notified by the city of Fredericksburg that we could not have a church in that house unless the owners of the house were willing to revert from a commercial zoning to a residential zoning. So we had our first zoning battle, with many, many more to come in the years ahead. But this one we lost because we didn't own the property. And the people that did own it said, no, we can't lose the commercial. So they said, you've got to be out. You got to be out by the end of February. And so we were in a quandary. And so but we went ahead with our organizational services. And what we did is we had our services. Now, Ron McMullen, our pastor in faith of our sending church, he came, and we had special meetings from Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday morning. Then we had a dinner at the church on that Sunday afternoon, and then we moved to the Virginia room of what was then the Howard Johnson Hotel there on Route 1. We moved there for a 2:30 service, and this was our organizational service and also my ordination service. I had wanted to be ordained at Highland Park, but they only ordained, they didn't want to be an ordination mill, so they only ordained people that were either accepted by a missions board or that were going to an established church. And so they said if I wanted to come back after the church was established, they would ordain me. But I thought, well, if we've already established the church, why not just let that church ordain us? That seems to be the more biblical model anyway, that where the pastor comes out of the congregation. So that's what we did. And so we met at the Virginia room. And matter of fact, Shirley and I went back just recently, and it's now the Country Inn and Suites. It's no longer the Howard Johnson, but the Virginia room is still there, and it's still labeled as the Virginia room, still set up in the same way. And it's obviously been redecorated a time or two, I'm sure, but that was a blessing just to be back in that room, where those services took place. At 2 o'clock, we met with the presbytery, the ordaining council, and answered any private questions that they might have. And then we had the public questioning in the service. But our first, we organized the church, and we had 13 members that signed the charter on that day. And then the first act of business, was to call me as pastor and to call for my ordination. And then our second act of business was to take on our first missionary, because we wanted our church to have a biblical foundation. I'm going to talk a little more about that, but one thing we wanted to do is from square one, we wanted to be involved in reaching the whole world. That was, the whole purpose is the Great Commission, and we took on our first missionary, Bill and Terry Craig, and their children were with us for that service. And I think we had 42 people in the morning service. We had many more for the afternoon because we had people coming in from other churches with the pastors that were there for the ordination. That's why we'd chosen the big room. So we went through the questioning, and I had my ordination, and then we took on the Craigs. And then after the service that day, a good group of us, of the people that were now members of the newly organized Faith Baptist Church of Fredericksburg, Virginia, then we went out to Route 3 to look at a little house. It was a one-bedroom house with an unfinished basement on 3/4 of an acre of property. Went out to look at that as a place that we might consider. We wanted to get to Route 3 as soon as we could. We knew that Route 3 was scheduled for growth, and yet nothing was changing hands. There was nothing for sale because everybody was waiting on the commercial to come, and the commercial was not there. The residential wasn't even there at that point. We were in the country when you went out Route 3. So we took a group out and we looked over just until it was dark. We walked this property and we looked at this house, and it definitely was a step down from the quarters that we had on Route 1, and it was even a step down from the townhouse. This was a tiny little house. I think it was 24 by 28 or something like that. And that was counting a carport. So it was more like, I think it was 24 by 28, and then it was 24 by 40 if you counted the carport. But we needed a place, and so we decided that we would ask, to lease, the property, and that it was for sale. The man who had built the house never lived in it. He passed away as an older man, and so we were dealing with the family. They had tried to get commercial zoning for that, and commercial was right next door, but they were kind of locked up in a timely process with the county. They had given up on that, and so they put it up on the market, and we were the only people, because I had looked at another piece of property that one of the brothers had owned, a house. Then he put us in touch, and so it was never on the market. And they offered it to us for $29,000, which was $29,000 more than we had, but it was on Route 3. It was a foothold on Route 3, and so we decided to rent it from them and to put a contract for purchase. And so we got a 90-day contract, so at the end of February, or in the month of February, we moved out from Route 1 to Route 3. In the meantime, though, on our organization day, Carl and Mary Fretcher, which became very, very dear members of Faith Baptist, they were in the service that morning. They had come. I had found that the little ads that I was putting in, just giving my sermon titles, were not very effective. And so what I had an idea, and I started a little column. I called it As I See It, and I would put, As I See It. I had my picture, and then because we didn't have a church picture or anything like that we could do, and so I put As I See It, and then when I would give a topic, and basically 1 week it would be some way of presenting the plan of salvation. The next week it would be some question or argument that might catch attention. And my format for this, it differed according to what it was about, but I'd take a paragraph and basically ask the question, and then I would have a paragraph, with the scripture's answer, and then the third paragraph was always, for further information, contact Pastor Don Forrester at such and such number, or attend the services of Faith Baptist Church, and gave whatever our address was at that particular point. And I put this on the second page. I didn't want it with the church ads. I wanted it to look like a column in the paper. And the only thing they didn't want, I was not a column in the paper, and so they weren't going to print it just like everything else. But what they did was they just changed the type a little bit so that it was not the same as the regular paper. But most people just thought it was a column in the paper. And so I actually got a little following. People that were, approved of what was said, would start visiting the church. People that did not approve of what was being said would write me nasty letters. And so I was... this seemed to be much more effective, and I did this as long as I could afford it. We did it for a year or two, and as we got into buildings and so forth, and it got to a place where I just couldn't do that on a regular basis. And we did it from time to time later on. But this was very effective in the beginning. The Fretchers came as a result of one of those articles. But they didn't stay for our organizational service because she had something on the stove. They lived out by Lake Anna. And then the next week, as a result of the As I See It column, George and Roberta Rohn, who had moved down to Stafford from Northern Virginia, came. And so they both were visiting. They had not joined the church at this point. We left our church charter open, by the way, for 90 days, and so we had many, many more that were charter members by the time we got through those next 3 months. But the Fretchers came, the Rohns came while we were still in that building. Most of the people that came from the apartments and so forth, once we moved to Route 3, those did not make the transition. We didn't want to transition many times because that was always costly for us. But so we set a date to move. It was I think it was a holiday. I think maybe President's Day or something like that. I think at that point it may have been George Washington's birthday or Lincoln's. I can't remember. I don't think it had become officially President's Day at that point. But we set that date, and that morning we got up on that holiday, and it was snowing. And I thought, and it was a rainy, slushy snow, and I thought, is anybody going to come? We still lived in Falmouth. We were still in the townhouse. And so I called every man in the church, and they said, no, that this is not a good time to move. We're not coming. And so I didn't go out to the church because, that was not going to happen. And then I got a phone call, and it was Carl Fletcher in a phone booth with George Rohn, and they were saying, "Where is everybody?" and so our two visitors, showed up for the move when all of our members, didn't. And I said, "I'll be right there." And so Shirley and I hopped in the car, and we came out with our kids, and we loaded all the things from the church there, and we hauled them in several trips. The snow stopped, and it actually turned out to be one of those nice February days, and so we made the move. With our visitors, who both became very faithful long-term members of our church. And matter of fact, Carl and Mary were in our church till they both passed away many years later. And the Rohns have been in and out of our church, have been mainly in for the overall this time. Still very active with our church congregation. We made the move out to our new location, and we started services there either the first Sunday of March or the last Sunday of February. I don't remember, but that was quite a change because we had to figure out how to use the building. There wasn't a room that was upstairs that was large enough for our congregation. Even though our congregation was very small. We'd grown, 42 was our high Sunday on our organization day. I think we had 25 to 30s that were in the little building on Route 1 that we were averaging in that area. I think we had a high of 40 in December. 42 was our top number, not counting the organizational service itself, top number in January. And then looking, the numbers continued to increase. Matter of fact, I just went over those recently, the attendance records for that first year. I have them all in Braille. That's probably the only place they exist. But we grew each month, as we were moving along, which was not my memory. I thought, okay, we kind of stalled out, but we didn't. We actually kept growing. And by Easter, then, matter of fact, Palm Sunday was our high Sunday of 48, and then our Easter was, I think, 42 again, and then our highest attendance was in that summer of a high attendance of 90, and that was our God and Country service, which we really put on a big push. As a matter of fact, that was an interesting story because the house, we used what would have been the living room as our adult Sunday school. We used the bedroom where as the children's class and the nursery. And I think we had the kids' class in the kitchen, and then the bedroom was the nursery. And then we used the downstairs, which was just a concrete floor, bare block walls, bare insulation on the ceiling, just the bare bulbs, no light fixtures hanging down for lights, no heat, no air conditioning in the basement. But that was our church auditorium. And I can assure you that no one came for our facilities. No one. Everybody there was there for a good reason. But we grew in that building, and we so by the time we got to July, for one thing, you didn't want to meet in that basement on July 6th. That was the date that year for that service. We didn't want that in the basement in the afternoon. We did in the morning. And I don't know the exact attendance for that, but it was a good attendance. And then the afternoon service we had 90, which was our record attendance for anything at that point by far. And we had Wayne Thompson come from Ingleside Baptist Church, and he was the preacher, and he brought with him an instrumental group that was Soldiers of the Cross, I think was the name of that. And then he brought a quartet called The Lighthouse. And lo and behold, that was the first day we met Jeff Murphy, not knowing that Jeff was just a young man at the time, and it may have even been a teenager, I'm not sure, but he was there with Brother Thompson, and they sang beautifully, and we didn't know that we had a great future, with both in our church later. The DeBoers, Carol DeBoer, and her Carol DeBoer was Wayne Thompson's daughter. They were in our church for many years. Matter of fact, Matt Speck, her son, married Summer, Perry's daughter, and they're pastoring down in Southern Virginia today. And but lots of links there, but that was our first introduction to Jeff Murphy and to what later was going to be a very important part of our church as far as their family and the offshoots of their family. Then, but that was our big service, and then as we moved into the fall. Then we realized we needed to get our building going. Now, let me just stop here, because we desperately needed to plan a building. Now, the lot next door was an acre and a half, and the family that owned the house that we were renting was the Cuby family, and then the next door lot was the John Kelly family. And he had wanted to put a hardware store on that, and again was kind of locked up with the county on getting the commercial permit. And so when the Cubys were contracted to sell, then the Kellys also agreed to sell theirs, because they couldn't get the zoning separately. They were in that together. So they very graciously sold for what they had paid for it, and so that was $15,000. A piece of property that would be worth, well, it'd be at least $1.5 million today. But anyway, so for $44,000 we could purchase that, and then so I went to the bank, to borrow $65,000, and that was to be to buy our properties, and then to put about $15,000 into a building, which we would build ourselves, to get us into our first church. And so I went to the savings and loan to discuss a mortgage, and I met with Mr. Francis King. As a matter of fact, I still have my notes from that meeting and his response. I went, we made our presentation, and he said, okay. Now he said, first of all, he said, why a church in Fredericksburg? He said, we have churches that are 200 years old. And so I told him, that we wanted a church that was really serious about the Great Commission, that we wanted a church that was actively evangelistic, that had sound Bible teaching, that was aggressive in trying to reach the community and so forth, none of which probably impressed him, but that was our purpose. And so he said, okay. He said, how many people do you have? And I said, well, you have 40. And he said, well, are you talking about 40 families? And I said, no, we're talking about 40 people. And he said, well, you're talking about 40 adults, right? And I said, well, no, we're talking about 40 people. About half of them are adults. and he just laughed and said, I'm sorry, there's not a thing we can do for you. And so I was disappointed, but we looked at every means of financing we could find. None of us, we were all young people, and with the exception of the Frechers at that point. And as a matter of fact, we were beginning to, to fill in the gaps here. During that spring, the Jones family came. She played the piano, and that was a wonderful blessing. Because listen, in the beginning, I was the song leader, and I am no song leader. And Shirley was the pianist, and she doesn't play the piano. She could pick out a couple of, she could do a chord with one hand and get us through. It was okay. It was the best we could do. But we were looking forward, to getting someone that could help us with the music. And in that spring of '75, shortly after we organized, so the Terwilliger family came, and the Terwilligers were such a blessing to us. And he took over leading the singing and did so for years. And then the Jones family came, Don and Dorothy Jones. And it's Dan and Rita Terwilliger, and then Don and Dorothy Jones. And he was a retired high official in the State Department, Defense Department, I'm sorry. And just a very dignified gentleman, and she played the piano. And so that was a tremendous help. So that little basement came to life, and with Dan leading the singing, and with Dorothy Jones on the piano. And so we began to grow, and we had a lot of families that came to us during that time. The Wilsons, Grant and Jenny Wilson. Grant is still in our church. The Terwilligers were in our church. They moved off to Arizona, came back for a few years here just recently. They're back in Arizona now because of the weather. And but Grant is still in our church, is faithful there, and we've so appreciated him. But anyway, the church began to fill in as far as all the ages. We weren't just kids anymore. At one point, you were just people in our 20s and people under 10 years old. So it started filling out. But we were not a church of any means. We did not have any resources, no big building fund that was saved up, and so we began to look at our options, and our best choice was to do a bond issue. A lot of churches, in the 70s, got into trouble with bonds because they did general revenue bonds and they couldn't pay them. But we did a first mortgage bond, and so that our properties actually stood good for the debt, and we were very serious, and we were able to get more interest in that, get a better interest rate at that. But we were a young church, and so selling $65,000 worth of church bonds was a project. It was they were in denominations of 250, 500, and 1,000, and that took a lot of work to get that done. And George Rohn and I basically were the chief merchandisers of the church bonds, and so we set a date for closing on the property, and we did not sell enough bonds to close with the both. We needed the $44,000 to close on both properties, and in 90 days we were not able to get that. And so they gave us a 60-day extension and told us that would be all that we got. And so we almost got to that, but we didn't quite get there. And so I had a friend in Chattanooga that had become a lawyer, and he had an insurance settlement that we had discussed, and so I called him and I said, is there any way you could just loan us for a few weeks, a little bit of money to get us through our closing? And he said, well, sure. So he said he'd wire it to us. Now, I always thought a wire meant that you loaded it on one end and it immediately arrived at the other, but that is not true, at least not in those days. And so I had our church treasurer, which was George Rohn, write out a check for the $44,000. We took that to the closing, and we got to the closing, and the lawyer was shocked that I had a check. He said, "No, this has to be a certified check or a cashier's check." And I said, "Well, I didn't know that." And he said, "Well, we can't close until that's there." And I said, "Okay." And so they postponed it from, this was probably 11 o'clock in the morning, they postponed it till I think 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I'd already checked the bank before going to the closing, and the money from Chattanooga had not arrived. And so I thought, okay, now I may have trouble getting a certified check. Plus, I can't write a check. I can't get a check. I said, I'll have to find George. He's at work in Springfield. And I just didn't know what to do. I didn't want to show back up to this meeting empty-handed. I was afraid that people would just cancel the whole deal, and I think they would have. And so Shirley and I said, "Well, what do we do?" I said, "Well, we need to go home, and we need to get on the phone. We need to find George and see if there's any way he can get down here." And this is one of those amazing things that happened. But so we got on Route 1. We're heading back to Falmouth. We got to the Falmouth light, and sitting at the Falmouth light on the other side of the intersection was George Rohn, in his vehicle. So we honked and got him to stop, and he, for some reason, was off work that day. And so he went with us, wrote the check to the bank, but the money still had not come. So we didn't have enough. He wrote the check for the $44,000 for the certified check, but it wasn't there. Shirley and I sat in the bank waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally, when it was about 5 minutes till 2 o'clock and it was time for us to leave and go to the meeting, then we said, it's just not going to be here. We're just going to have to go face the music and tell them, what's happened, and try to get them to postpone. And so just one last check, and it was there. And we got our certified check, went to the closing. They never knew that we had any problem with that at all. And we bought our property. But then we had to, of course, finish selling the bonds in order to build our building. And but so in October, we began we got our building permit. And as a matter of fact, the interesting days, in those days, churches were loved and accepted in communities. We went out to the county, and we had our church drawn out on a sheet of notebook paper. Just a floor plan. It was 40 by 60, just a simple construction. And they gave us a building permit as long as we could get the engineering drawings for the trusses that were going to be the roof. And so we did that, and we got our building permit. Now, interestingly enough, during the time that we were meeting in the house, I got a call from the zoning administrator, and he said, "Listen," he said, are you meeting in that house for church services?" And I said, "Yes, we are." And he said, "Well, do you know that the ordinances do not allow you to meet in the house or to meet anywhere, without a conditional use permit?" And I said, "But you have to own the property to get that, right?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, we're in the process of buying the property, and then we can start that process." And he said, "Well, you can't meet until you buy the property and until you go through the zoning process." I said, "How long does that take?" He said, "About 90 days. And I said, "Well, we can't do that. For one thing, that it can't be constitutional, for you to say that churches cannot meet, or that religious groups cannot meet in a house." And he said, "Well, it hasn't been challenged." And I said, "Well, then we're going to meet, because we can't raise the money to buy the property and build a building until without meeting." And so we're kind of, you're forcing in position just not to you want us to either disband, or we're going to have to violate the law. And he said, "Well," he said, "we're not going to prosecute you or persecute you." He said, "We're not going to do anything, but he said, it bothers me that our higher institutions, would disobey the law. And I said, well, I think this higher institution is going to have to listen to a higher authority because, we're going to start this church, and according to your rules, we cannot start until we already own property. And he said, well, that was true. Now, over the years, we became great friends. That zoning administrator was a great help to us in so many challenges along the way. But we did go to the county, and I explained to the administrator our problem. He brought in the building inspector, and he told us to give us that, since the only place that the whole group would be was in the basement. He said that obviously can't be an issue, and he had him give us the permit. So we did get a permit, even though we didn't have the conditional use for the church. But so we were ready to break ground in October, and at this point we scheduled our first missions conference. We did so in connection. We shared missionaries with Temple Baptist in Stafford. We had 2, and I think they had 3. As a matter of fact, I just came across the ad for that meeting. Bill Craig and Coy Shaw. Bill Craig we had already taken on as missionary, and Coy Shaw came in April back in the spring, and we took him on as our second missionary. And interestingly enough, those were 2 friends from seminary, and have been dear friends for my entire ministry. My first trip out of the country was to do the dedication service for the first building that the Craigs built in Japan, Nishinomiya. And but those 2 missionaries were our first 2 missionaries, and they are both still on the field. Bill Craig in Japan, and Coy Shaw in Brazil, even to this very day. What a blessing that's been. But so Coy was there for the missions conference, and we were ready to start our building. And so my brother Alan was serving as contractor, and of course he couldn't be there during the day, so he chalked out, he used lime and marked the lines for the perimeter of the building, and we hired a man with a backhoe to come in to dig the footings. And so Coy's job was to hold the target, the guide, and to guide the shovel, the backhoe, along the outside of that line. But for some reason or another, and I've never mentioned this to Coy, so I don't know if he will be watching this video, but at one end of the building, Coy, for some inexplicable reason, moved to the inside of the line instead of the outside of the line, which put the trench, 2 foot off. That was short of where it needed to be, by the width of the ditch. And we could not afford, we had no money to get the backhoe out for another occasion. And so Grant Wilson and I decided we could do this. We could just dig that trench 2 foot wider on that end of the building. It's only 40 feet. But let me tell you that ground was so hard. It's just rocky soil. It was horribly difficult. And it literally was pick and shovel. He would, use the pick and knock out another chunk, and I would shovel it out of the hole. And it was a warm day in October, and gnats everywhere. We were sweating profusely. It was awful. It was back-breaking work, and it took us more than one day, but we did get that done. Now, I'll say this. Now, that is the building that is now the nursery school, the preschool wing. And that end of the building, it is never going to slide down the hill. The footer is 4 feet wide at that particular place, and that is, it's going to, even the big earthquake's not going to move that part of the building. And I'm very confident of that I know just exactly how deep and how thoroughly dug that footer was. So we got started with our building. And the men of our church, all of us, everybody, it wasn't just the men, everybody, we worked, and all we could afford was the materials. All the labor was donated. We paid for the concrete, and we had a guy that poured the concrete for us. And matter of fact, I just came across. I was preaching over at Crossroads. At Vision Baptist, and that man is a member of that church. He's 94 years old. He was not there that Sunday, but it was the prayer request for him is what caught my attention. But he did the concrete work for us in our first two buildings. But so he poured the floor. It was late getting done. We had to do it. We had to use car headlights to get it finished in time. It was just quite an experience. And we got the walls up and got the roof on. And so in November, we had everything done. We had the tar paper, the builder's felt on the roof. But we had a big storm come in, and it blew the felt off of the roof. And Shirley and I, we didn't know that that was ruined. That you couldn't, after being torn loose, it was not going to be suitable to be put back on the roof. But we chased it down on Route 3. Literally chasing it down the highway, and they would catch it and put a cinder block on the strip of this stuff. And in the process, she got pneumonia. And this was kind of one of those dark times because she got sick. We were now about 15 months into our time in Fredericksburg. All of our support from other churches, except for our home church, was gone. Actually, there were two churches that were supporting us. And Shirley had to go stay with one of my brother's families in Northern Virginia while she was recuperating with the kids. And then we got a letter from the other church, not our home church, but the other church that was still supporting us and saying, hey, look, you went there, we supported you for 6 months, and that was the normal time in those days for supporting a church. And we renewed your support for another 6 months. That's expired, and obviously if it hasn't happened now, if you're not self-supporting by this point, then you just need to face the Lord's will and find what it is God actually wants you to do. And it was worded better than that, but that was the gist of the letter. And it seems unkind, but I do know the man that wrote it, and I think he honestly was trying to give me good advice. He thought that this was really not going to work out for us. And Shirley and I looked at this, and we never wavered in our determination, but we did pray and seek the Lord's guidance in this, and we decided, sink or swim, live or die, what God had called us to Fredericksburg, and we were going to finish the church. The weather had turned bad, attendance was down, Shirley was sick, Christmas was coming. It was, it just was a dark period, but we had hoped to get the building completely under roof before the bad weather set in, but it came early. We didn't make that. We did finally get the roof on, but it was slow going. And then, we had to. It just reaffirmed our commitment to see it through. Now, in early January, Alan and Steve, my brothers, Steve had come that summer of '75 to live with Alan. He lived in Northern Virginia. He was working with Alan's contractor company, and they took off work, and they finished our building to the place that we could get an occupancy permit. They took 2 weeks and just dedicated 24 hours a day. They slept in our kitchen. And by that time, we could not afford both the property. Once we had bought the properties, we could not afford that and a separate house. And so we moved into the church. It was a dual occupancy. Shirley and I and our boys lived there. They lived in the nursery. We had the downstairs. And anyway, they came and finished got the building to a place where we could get an occupancy. And so on January 19th, I think it probably was the 18th or the 20th, is the next year, on that third week of January, our anniversary Sunday, we moved in to our first church building. And at that point, we were there. Our attendance jumped to 82. I think it was 83 that we had on that Sunday. and never really to significantly go down from there. Matter of fact, by Easter of that year, just a few months later, we had 110, and we were on our way. And matter of fact, by that summer, we had the complete building finished, and I was on full time. And we were able to notify the one church that was still supporting us, our home church, that we were now self-sustaining. And so we were, from the time that we rented the townhouse in July of 74 to the summer of 76, it was 2 years, and our church was fully supported with its own parsonage, its own building, and with its pastor supported by the church congregation. And what a blessing, what a step forward that was. It was a transitional time for our ministry.